If you know somebody who could use some help marketing their business, if you would take the couple seconds to share this podcast with them, I would greatly appreciate it. Word of mouth is by far one of the best ways to organically market, so that would be greatly appreciated. Thanks. What's up, and welcome back to the Matt Pete Marketing Podcast. Are you sure you should start a podcast? Let's talk about that a little bit more. So, a few episodes back, I talked about listening to your audience. Well, I've been practicing that recently, and I have had multiple conversations with people over the past few weeks that have talked about starting a podcast, wanting to start a podcast, doesn't think they should start a podcast, but I have great reason to think they should. Lots of reasons I think people should have a podcast, even if you're not doing it for a business. But one of the people I was talking to about why they should start a podcast, they just don't think they should. And I can tell that they were looking for a reason out of it because they sent me an article a few days after our conversation, and it talks about why you shouldn't start a podcast. I'm not going to tell the name of the article or the person who wrote it because I don't want to drag anybody, but I did want to talk about some of the points they made and why I think they're very wrong. So in no specific order, let's go through the points this author made really quick about why you should not start a podcast. So one of the points they made was when you're expecting a mass audience, huge audience to come through your doors the second you launch your podcast. Maybe that's why you shouldn't start a podcast, because you're expecting too much. You're expecting too many people to show up. That's a horrible reason, because everybody has to start somewhere. Yes, if you don't already have an audience, then more than likely when you launch your podcast, you're not going to have a giant audience. And I know a lot of people launch a podcast because they think, if you build it, they will come. That's not the case. That's never the case. I mean, unless you have access to an already existing audience, more than likely when you launch your first thing, it's not going to have a huge audience unless it is just so unique that it catches fire, like Entrepreneurs on Fire or like Lore, something so different and so well done that it can't help but catch on. But there's, like he mentions, there's millions of podcasts out there that never catch on. But that's millions of people willing to put some of their money on the line to host this stuff, or a lot of their time on the line to produce this content, to say, I think I have something unique, I'm going to put it out there. And no, not everything catches on. But imagine if the top leaders that you listen to decided, I'm not going to start my podcast because I know I'm not going to get a big audience right out the gate. That's a horrible reason not to start a podcast. You can have a niche. I have a buddy who had a podcast in the choir industry. He didn't have a huge following, but his target audience was so niche that he didn't need a huge following to have a actual paying podcast, a podcast that made him money because of the niche that he had chosen. So yeah, don't expect a mass audience, but if this is your first thing, you probably weren't going to anyways. So yeah, you should start a podcast. Another point he mentioned is when everything else has failed. So if you've launched YouTube or your own website or social media platforms, he talks about how putting the same content into a podcast is just going to fail. So why even do it? Because everything else has failed. That is such a defeatist mentality. That's so sad. I mean, I feel like you can hear that, like me reading that. Like literally the title of that point is when everything else has failed. So if you've tried everything, I guess just throw your hands up and quit, because podcasting isn't going to work because nothing else did. That sounds so defeatist. So Lore, I mentioned that a few seconds ago. If you've never heard of that podcast, is a huge podcast. He just talks about folklore around the world and different things that, in history that have or have not happened, kind of things. It's a really good podcast. But the way that show started out, I actually met Aaron Mahnke a few years back, the creator of the podcast. He was at a conference I was shooting, and he talked about how Lore was created. He is an author, a book writer. He writes books on this stuff. And he thought, what if I created these little PDFs, these little downloadable fiction stories or lore stories that I could give away on my website? Somebody buys a book or, a lead magnet, I could get their email address if they wanted to download this story. So he did. He put it out in PDF form. He showed it to his buddy. He's like, what do you think? His buddy's like, oh no. So he put it in PDF. That didn't work. He recorded the audio. He's like, I'm going to give away the MP3s when people sign up. That was his next step. His buddy came to him. He's like, you created a podcast, man. He's like, what's a podcast? That show took off like wildfire. He ended up getting a show on Amazon Prime TV. He has made a ton of money, all kinds of sponsors. It took off, but he created it on accident. I mean, he had tried doing all this stuff. He had written books and had some moderate success writing some lore books, but the podcast, same content, repurposed in audio form, took off just because he took it in a different direction. So just because everything else has failed, every other way you put it out there has failed, doesn't mean it's not right for a podcast. Maybe you've written a book. Maybe your audience isn't into reading. Maybe your audience wants Facebook Lives or TikToks. Just because you tried it one way doesn't mean it's going to fail every other way. Another way, or another reason as to why you shouldn't start a podcast, is when you don't have something unique to say. Now, this may come as a surprise to you, but I'm not the only marketing podcast in the world. Yes, there are many others, and there are many others that are larger than mine. Go figure. I mean, Russell Brunson has a podcast called Marketing Secrets. Rachel Peterson has a podcast about marketing. Who am I? Online Marketing Made Easy. I mean, there's so many podcasts out there about marketing, yet I have one too, because I bring my own unique perspective to it. I've had my own unique experiences. I bring something different to the table just by being myself. So yeah, if you don't have something unique to say, I feel like, he says, are you just another voice on topics thousands of other people are already podcasting on? Again, such a defeatist mentality, because if I put out this podcast and it encourages one other person to start a podcast and maybe that podcast takes off, then I've done a great thing. I have influenced somebody to do something that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise done. So yeah, maybe there are other people speaking on it and not having a unique voice. Like, if you're going to put out a podcast, sit down and think about what you want to do and how you want to structure it. Not every one of my episodes has an interview. I said from episode 1 that I wanted to mix in some solo episodes and some interviews, because that's how I like my podcast to go. There are a lot of times when I go through phases of wanting to listen to interview shows, and then I want to listen to shorter solo episodes from people. So I decided to do a show with both. So whenever somebody tells you you don't have a unique voice, so what are you going to say on the topic? I don't have a unique voice, but I have unique experiences. I was able to meet people like John Lee Dumas and Russell Brunson and Todd Dickerson and all these people that I've got to meet in the entrepreneur space that otherwise I should not have been able to meet when I met them, because relatively I was a nobody. Yet I was able to do it because I didn't listen to people who said, if you don't have a unique story, you might as well not try. You do have a unique story. Maybe you have a cool, unique background, or maybe you have a great way of asking questions. I mean, there's so many ways to have a unique story that this guy is just putting a blanket statement over. If you don't have something unique to say, what does that even mean? I feel like that's just, when people are looking up this content, they're in a certain state of mind of defeatism where they want a reason not to start it. So they're already telling themselves, I don't have anything unique to say. Who am I to say something? Who am I to start a podcast? And this guy comes along and is like, yeah, if you don't have something unique to say, you just need to sit down and shut up. Like, that's a horrible reason to not start a podcast, because I guarantee you, if you start a podcast, eventually you will say something that is unique. You give a monkey a typewriter, he's going to type every word in the English dictionary at some point. Put a microphone in front of you, you have to talk. It gives you that the accountability of putting out episodes. You have to put out content. It's a great way to hold yourself accountable. And eventually you're going to say something unique, and you're going to find that niche, and you're going to be able to grow that niche. You're going to be able to serve those people that listen to your podcast. More than likely won't be the dude that wrote this article. And when you're simply repurposing content, now this is one where I can almost agree with him. If you're simply repurposing content, because I have listened to podcasts that were YouTube videos, and the person said, hey, I want to get into podcasting. So they simply took their content, their YouTube videos, ripped the audio, and put it as a podcast. And you can hear them say, look at this, or I'll show you this on my screen, and you can't see it. So yes, a caveat, like maybe you shouldn't repurpose just all of your content. But there's a large portion of content that can be repurposed. You've heard me on the show talk about repurposing content. I think repurposing content is gold. I wonder if this guy would agree with taking podcasts and posting them on Instagram or TikTok or Facebook, because that's repurposing content from something else. And people do it every single day. If you're on TikTok, you see all the YouTubers. There's one going viral right now about a snail. If a snail, you could get all the money in the world you want, but a snail, if he touches you, you're going to die instantly. That's like a thing. Look it up. It's going viral on TikTok and it's from a podcast. So yeah, repurposing, in my opinion, is great. So if you have content you're already putting out, more than likely you can repurpose that content. And if it's directly driven to be a visual element, then think, hey, how can I repurpose this content? Is any part of it repurposable? Maybe the topics can be repurposed just into a podcast episode. Maybe you don't necessarily need to rewrite or reinvent the wheel, but you can record those episodes, those topics you've talked about, just in a podcast style where you're not talking about looking at this or seeing what's on screen, but you can still repurpose those ideas, that content, the stuff you've written down, kind of like the guy from Lore, to go back to that. He had written them down in PDFs. He had recorded MP3s. He just needed to put it out as a podcast. He changed the way the initial purpose was to give it away as a PDF. He changed the way that he was going to put it out in podcast form. And now he makes a lot of money from that show. All of that to say, yeah, you do need a podcast. Why? It's not the short-term play. If you're like, hey, I need money right now, again, unless you already have an audience and can sell sponsorships right off the bat, more than likely podcast isn't going to be your play. But if you need money right now, I would still say start a podcast. It gives you so much more credibility, so much more accountability. If you're somebody who likes to put off work, start a podcast. Because if you say, I'm going to put out a podcast once a week on this day at this time, every week I put out a podcast on Wednesday at 3:30. That has so much accountability to me. I talked about it in the other podcasting episode. So much accountability that it gets me working, because I know I have to put out content. I know I have to be reaching out to people when I want to have guests on the show. There's a certain level of accountability that comes with having a podcast and putting out content. So if you're somebody who procrastinates a lot, definitely start a podcast and hold yourself to that release date. Never miss it. I'm not going to say never buy into the whole seasons. Some people put out the podcast and they do seasons of their show. Season 1, then they'll pause it and they'll do season 2. If you're somebody who procrastinates or comes up with reasons, I guess it's procrastinating, not to do the thing, not to launch the thing, not to create the podcast, don't do seasons, because you'll pause a season and you won't come back. Never miss a week. If you have to batch record to get you through Christmas and New Year's and whatever, don't miss a week. And don't listen to all the naysayers out there saying this is why you shouldn't start a podcast. Yeah, they're getting feedback and they're getting reach on their articles, on their content they're putting out, because like I said, they're preying on the people who are looking for an out. I don't think you need an out. You're listening to this podcast because you don't want an out. You want a way through. Podcast is the long play. You start a podcast today, it might not pay off next month. It might not pay off this year. But in 2, 3, 4 years, after you have a huge library, even if you're releasing once a month, that's not a ton of work to put into something that could eventually have you showing the credibility of somebody who's a leader in your industry because you've been talking about it for X amount of months, days, years, whatever. But it helps people believe. It's kind of like writing a book. If you write a book, it gives you that credibility. If you have a podcast, it gives you credibility. Same way. So start a podcast today, because it will only lead to good things. I genuinely, I don't see a negative in starting a podcast, and the way that this guy was able to maneuver around and find some negatives shows me that he's probably wasn't in the best place when he wrote this, maybe having some own struggles with his own podcast or something along those lines. But yeah, if you don't feel like you have a voice, trust me, you do. You have a unique voice in there. Don't let that stop you from putting out a podcast. I'm going to end it right there because I think you get the point. Go ahead and start your podcast. I'm actually going to be putting out a course soon on how to create your podcast. Follow along at mattpete.com. You can sign up for my email newsletter there. I'm going to be putting it together, and it's going to show you everything from the recording process to how I put it in my editor, how I edit it, how I export it, how I upload it, how it goes out to iTunes and Spotify and Google and Alexa and all these different places. I'm going to show you every step of that method because, like I said, listen to your audience. I've had multiple conversations over the past few weeks with people who want to start a podcast. They just don't know how. So I'm going to be back with you next week with some more great tips and advice on what you should be doing to market your business. I hope this helped. I hope this inspired you to start a podcast. And when you do start it, send it to me because I want to listen. Thanks. Have a great week. Remember that marketing really matters. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Matt Pete Marketing Podcast. If you know somebody who has a business and they could use some help marketing and growing their business, if you would just take a couple seconds to share this podcast with them, I would be grateful, and I know they would be as well. Thanks.